On the night of March 18th, 1314, Paris was silent, as if holding its breath. In the heart of the medieval city, on a small island in the Seine just across from the towering facade of Notre Dame, a wooden pyre had been prepared, bound tightly in chains. Wearing a simple tunic soaked in the chill of early spring, stood a man who once commanded armies and answered to no king, Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar. He didn't cry out. He didn't beg. As the flames licked his feet and rose to consume his body, he turned to the crowd and raised his voice not in pain, but in defiance. What he said next would echo through the centuries like a curse etched into stone that both King Philip IV of France and Pope Clement V, the very men who condemned him, would stand before God within the year. And then, with a grim calmness that chilled even his executioners, he let the fire take him. In a world still ruled by the divine right of monarchs and the iron authority of the Church, Jacques de Molay died not as a heretic, but as a man too powerful, too independent, and too inconvenient to live. His death marked the end of the Templars, but also the beginning of one of the most haunting legends in Western history. It was not just the burning of a man, but the execution of an idea that even those closest to God could be broken by earthly power. And yet, within months, Pope Clement was dead. By year's end, King Philip followed his reign ended not by sword or poison, but by a sudden accident no one could explain. Coincidence, divine justice, or the last vengeance of a man who died without flinching, staring down the throne and the tiara with eyes that refused to close. Tonight, the flames that took de Molay are long extinguished, but his shadow still walks the banks of the Seine. In the aftermath of the First Crusade, as blood still soaked the soil of Jerusalem and weary Christian pilgrims flooded the Holy Land, 9 knights from France took an oath unlike any sworn before. They pledged poverty, chastity, obedience, and one more thing to defend travelers on the perilous roads between Jaffa and Jerusalem. What began as a modest vow in 1119 quickly transformed into one of the most powerful and feared organizations in medieval Europe, the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, known simply as the Knights Templar. They wore white mantles marked with a red cross, symbols of purity and divine mission, but their influence extended far beyond the battlefield. Within decades, they owned castles, vineyards, entire fleets of ships. They built outposts stretching from the British Isles to Cyprus. In an age when literacy was rare and coinage unstable, they created a system of credit and deposit that rivaled modern banking. A nobleman could leave gold in Paris and retrieve its equivalent in Jerusalem with a coded slip of parchment, an innovation centuries ahead of its time. The Templars were warrior monks, but they operated like an empire. They answered only to the Pope, bypassing kings and bishops alike. They brokered treaties, moved armies, and loaned money to monarchs who once scorned them. They became so rich, so politically connected, that even the Vatican tread lightly. In the secular courts of Europe, their immunity bred resentment. In the courts of heaven, they claimed righteousness. But on earth, they wielded a more dangerous kind of power trust. Into this world stepped Jacques de Molay, born around 1243 in Burgundy, in what is now eastern France. A second son of minor nobility, he joined the Templars in his early 20s, likely inspired by tales of holy war and divine destiny. Over the next 4 decades, he rose through the ranks with quiet discipline and a stubborn sense of purpose. By 1292, he had been elected Grand Master, just 1 year after the fall of Acre. the last Crusader stronghold in the Levant. The dream of Christian Jerusalem had collapsed. The Templars were no longer defending pilgrims in the East. They were retreating to Europe, uncertain, divided, and dangerously exposed. Jacques de Molay was not a reformer by nature, but necessity forced his hand. He reorganized the order's command structures, pushed for a new crusade to reclaim the Holy Land, and tried against increasing resistance to merge the Templars with the Knights Hospitaller, their rival military order. His vision was bold, but poorly timed. The Christian world was war-weary, the papacy in political crisis, and the coffers of Europe's kings were empty. Instead of allies, de Molay found suspicion. Instead of crusaders, he found debtors. By the early 1300s, the Templars had become victims of their own success. They held land in every corner of Christendom. They managed royal treasuries. They possessed the military might to outlast a siege, and the economic intelligence to outmaneuver a crown. But they had no true homeland, no single ruler to protect them. They were rich, stateless, and bound only by loyalty to a pope growing increasingly powerless. They had become what every king feared, a sovereign force without a nation. For Philip the Mom of France, known as Philip the Fair, this was intolerable. His kingdom was drowning in war debts. His court was weakened by infighting. And here stood a brotherhood of monks in armor, controlling ports, castles, and treasure troves across his land, answering to no one but Rome. Worse still, they had once denied him loans to a king desperate for gold and divine legitimacy. That was not just an insult, it was a challenge. Jacques de Molay had spent years defending the order from whispers and rumors. He had traveled to Cyprus, London, Rome, meeting with popes, negotiating with kings, trying to keep the Templar vision alive. But each year, the walls closed in tighter. Crusades no longer rallied the faithful. The Templars' spiritual purpose had faded, replaced by ledgers and land deeds. To their enemies, they no longer looked holy. They looked vulnerable. And yet, in the quiet halls of Templar commanderies, behind stone walls lined with scrolls and swords, de Molay still believed in the mission. He believed that a new holy war was possible, that Christendom would one day reclaim its sacred heart. He believed, perhaps tragically, that faith and gold could coexist. He did not know that a storm was already gathering, that in the shadows of the French court, a trap was being set, not on a battlefield, but in parchment and ink, not with swords, but with silence. And when it came, it would come not as war, but as betrayal. By the dawn of the 14th century, King Philip IV of France stood at the helm of a kingdom shimmering with the illusion of control, but cracking beneath the weight of debt. Known to his contemporaries as Philip the Fair, not for any virtue, but for his striking appearance, he had inherited more than a crown. He had inherited a treasury emptied by endless war, a nobility restless with resentment, and a church that increasingly slipped from his grasp. To secure his legacy, Philip would need more than just force. He would need an enemy the public feared, an excuse to confiscate unimaginable wealth, and a spectacle that masked political vengeance as divine justice. The Knights Templar were perfect. Their fortunes had once funded crusades, but now they guarded gold for nobles, lent money to kings, and managed the financial arteries of Europe. Philip had borrowed heavily from them to fund his conflicts against England and Flanders, only to find repayment increasingly impossible. The Templars refused to cancel his debts. They refused to become a tool of the French crown. And for that defiance, Philip decided they had to be erased, not just as an order, but as an idea. The plan was meticulous. For months, royal agents infiltrated Templar holdings, gathering rumors, bribing informants, and fabricating testimony. Accusations were crafted with precision and horror heresy, idol worship, sodomy, spitting on the cross, and secret rituals conducted in the shadows. These were not simply crimes, they were engineered to ignite outrage, to silence sympathy, and to strip the Templars of any moral defense. In a deeply religious society, the mere whisper of such charges was often more devastating than truth itself. On the morning of Friday, October 13th of 1307, the trap was sprung. Before sunrise, under orders sealed days in advance, Philip's forces moved across France with ruthless coordination. Knights were dragged from their beds, their temples raided, their records seized. Hundreds were arrested within hours. Among them was Jacques de Molay, then staying in Paris. Caught off guard, betrayed by the very society they once protected. The Templars faced not a military foe, but a legal machine honed to destroy them. The date Friday the 13th would echo through folklore for centuries, but its immediate meaning was far darker. It marked the beginning of a campaign, not just of imprisonment, but of erasure. In public declarations, Philip claimed he was defending the faith. In secret, he plotted the redistribution of Templar lands and the consolidation of their banking networks under royal control. What he sought was not repentance, but repossession. Jacques de Molay was no fool. He understood the language of courts, the weight of rumor, and the volatility of royal ambition. But he also clung to a belief that justice, however delayed, would eventually prevail. That the Church, still technically sovereign over the Templars, would intervene. That their history of service and sacrifice would not be forgotten. But Philip had already made sure the lines of authority were blurred. He had installed allies in key clerical positions and applied unbearable pressure on Pope Clement V, a Frenchman living in Avignon and vulnerable to the king's wrath. To the public, the arrests were portrayed as a necessary purging of evil. To the clergy, they were a test of loyalty. And to the Templars, they were a revelation their swords could not defend them against paper, and their loyalty to Christendom meant nothing in the face of sovereign greed. Still, there was one problem Philip had not anticipated. Jacques de Molay was too well known. Too many kings, dukes, and bishops across Europe had met him, respected him, entrusted him. For all the horror in the accusations, there remained doubt, and doubt, in a medieval inquisition, could be fatal not to the accused, but to the accuser. So the charges had to be reinforced. Torture would serve where testimony failed. Secrets would be extracted through fire and steel. Philip knew the machinery of fear better than any monarch of his age. And in his eyes, if a few bodies burned to cleanse the throne of debt and dissent, history would remember the purification, not the pain. As Paris buzzed with rumors and priests whispered their allegiance, a new kind of crusade began, not against the infidel, not for the Holy Land, but against memory itself, against a brotherhood that had stood too long, reached too high, and forgotten the one rule no power in Europe could ever break, that the king must always be feared more than the cross. The prisons of Philip IV were never meant for rehabilitation. They were built for silence, for submission, for the slow erosion of identity. When the doors closed behind the Knights Templar, they didn't just lose their freedom. They lost the right to exist in the eyes of the world. No court had yet ruled them guilty, but the punishment had already begun. And it began in darkness. Jacques de Molay, once the commanding Grand Master of a transcontinental order, now sat in a stone chamber with no heat, no light, and barely enough air. His hands, trained to hold sword and scripture, were chained. His food, if it could be called that, was doled out sporadically, always stale, sometimes spoiled. The water was foul. Sleep came only in brief spells, interrupted by footsteps that always meant one of two things questioning, or pain. What awaited the Templars wasn't inquiry, it was extraction. The king's men did not seek truth, they sought confession. And for that, there was no limit. The method most favored by interrogators was strappado, a rope tied to the wrists, looped over a beam, pulled upward until the shoulders tore from their sockets. Sometimes weights were added to the feet. Sometimes they let the victim fall, only to catch him again with a violent jolt. The pain wasn't temporary. It shattered joints, tore muscles, left permanent injury. Few screamed after the first few sessions. Most couldn't. Others were subjected to what would later be called water torture. A funnel jammed into the mouth, water poured in until the body convulsed. The lungs begged for breath, and the line between drowning and suffocating blurred. Still others endured heat-burning irons, coals pressed against the soles of feet, branding instruments applied to thighs and arms, not to kill, but to soften the mind and unravel the will. Some broke quickly. Others resisted for days, even weeks. But all were eventually worn down. The interrogators offered release, not through proof of innocence, but through admission of guilt. Sign here, and the pain ends. Confess, and your soul might still be saved. They used not just steel and flame, but scripture. They dangled absolution like bait in front of men who had built their lives on divine purpose. Jacques de Molay resisted longer than most, not because he was made of iron, but because he believed he could still negotiate. He still hoped the Pope would intervene. He thought the confessions, once known to be false, would be dismissed. But even he, under relentless pressure, eventually muttered admissions carefully worded, devoid of details, structured to satisfy the captors, but offer no true evidence. It was a desperate compromise, a line between self-preservation and loyalty. He would confess enough to survive, but not enough to betray his brothers. But the machinery of propaganda had already turned. The church, weakened and cornered, accepted the coerced confessions as evidence. The people, fed by pulpits and proclamations, began to turn away from the Templars. And the king, always one step ahead, had ensured that the prisons remained full long enough to finish the job. He didn't need the truth. He needed a narrative. Within weeks, the forced confessions were read aloud in cathedrals. Scribes copied them into records. And with every repetition, they hardened into something more dangerous than rumor official memory. What had been said under duress became gospel. What had been endured in silence became shame. But behind the prison walls, the Templars knew the truth. They whispered to one another through the cracks, scratched messages into stone. They refused to implicate each other, even as they endured more pain than most men would face in a lifetime. They still wore their white mantles, now soiled and torn, with a kind of defiant pride. For many, their final act of resistance was simply surviving long enough to face the fire with dignity. Jacques de Molay, though broken in body, remained whole in spirit. He knew the real trial hadn't yet begun, that it would come not in the torture chambers, but in the tribunal, not in the shadows, but under the eyes of the church and the people. And when it did, he intended to speak not as a prisoner, but as a witness to betrayal, and a man who had chosen silence over lies. What he didn't know was that the moment he opened his mouth again, the sentence had already been written, not with judgment, but with fire. Far from the smoke-filled prisons of Paris, nestled within the fortified papal court in Avignon, Pope Clement V sat between two fires. One burned with the fury of King Philip IV, unyielding, calculated, and dangerously close. The other smoldered beneath the surface of Christendom itself, doubt, unrest, and the slow unraveling of papal authority. Clement had not sought the papacy. He had been placed there by forces beyond his control, elevated as a compromise, but trapped from the moment he accepted the keys of St. Peter. Now, as word of the Templars' arrest spread across Europe, his silence grew heavier by the day. Officially, the Templars answered only to the Pope. Spiritually, organizationally, judicially, they were his responsibility. But Clement was not a man of confrontation. He was cautious, cerebral, and deeply aware of the precarious political balance that held the Church together. Philip's demands reached his desk not as suggestions, but as ultimatums. Pressure mounted in the form of letters, messengers, threats veiled in the language of duty and national interest. Philip did not request papal support, he expected it. At first, Clement attempted to stall. He opened a papal inquiry, summoned clerics, requested documentation. He hoped that time, tradition, and canon law might cool the crisis. But the king had already acted. The mass arrests, the published accusations, the seized treasuries. These were not just fait accompli, they were declarations. Philip had made his move, and Clement now had to choose defend the order and risk open war with the French crown, or yield and maintain a fragile peace. The confessions extracted under torture were delivered to Avignon with ceremonial solemnity. But Clement knew their origin. He read them with the eyes of a jurist, a theologian, and a man afraid. Some were absurd. Others contradicted themselves. None bore the signature of true guilt, yet he understood their power. In a church increasingly burdened by secular interference, perception could matter more than truth, and perception, once codified into doctrine or decree, could not easily be unraveled. So Clement compromised. He allowed Philip's tribunals to continue, but maintained a separate papal commission. He permitted interrogations, but insisted they be conducted under ecclesiastical oversight. It was a bureaucratic dance, meant to project control while avoiding confrontation. But every concession weakened the Templars further. Every delay allowed Philip's narrative to spread, and when rumors emerged of secret rituals, of strange icons, and blasphemous oaths, the pontiff's own cardinals began to shift in their seats. Fear of scandal, of schism, of loss overcame loyalty. Through it all, Jacques de Molay remained a silent presence. He refused to elaborate on his confession. He offered no names, no specifics. He asked to speak to the Pope in person, a request that was never granted. Instead, years passed. Trials dragged on. Many of his brothers died in custody. Others faded into obscurity. The order's properties were frozen, redistributed, or quietly absorbed by rival institutions. The Church's investigation yielded no definitive proof of heresy, yet it provided enough confusion to justify inaction. Clement's greatest weapon in decision had become the tool of erasure. Then, on March 18, 1314, Clement's tribunal summoned de Molay to publicly affirm his confession, standing alongside another Templar leader, Geoffrey de Charnay. De Molay looked not like a broken man, but a monument to exhaustion and resolve. His body had suffered, but his voice was clear. Before the assembled clerics, before the watching crowd, he withdrew every word he had previously uttered under torture. He declared the order innocent. He accused no one. He demanded only that history know the truth. For Clement, this was an act of rebellion. To recant was to defy both church and crown, to disrupt the delicate choreography of political survival. The papal commission was thrown into chaos. Clerics debated the implications. But Philip was not confused. He saw a challenge, and he acted with speed only monarchy affords. That same evening, without waiting for church deliberation, he ordered de Molay and de Charnay to be executed. Clement was left paralyzed. He issued no protest, no condemnation. His silence, once a strategy, had become complicity. He had tried to balance power with principle and found himself standing in the ashes of both. In the months that followed, the Pope's health declined rapidly. Those close to him spoke of guilt, of visions, of fear that the judgment he had deferred on earth was fast approaching from heaven. By summer, he was dead. Not from poison or blade, but from a sickness no physician could name. His organs failed. His breath shortened. His final hours were spent in agony. And though no chronicler recorded his last words, those who watched said his hands trembled as if reaching for something no relic or rosary could deliver. As dusk settled over Paris on March 18, 1314, the banks of the Seine swelled with silent onlookers. Word had spread quickly to Templar leaders. Jacques de Molay and Geoffrey de Charnay were to be executed without further trial. No bells rang, no royal decree was read. Just 2 wooden stakes erected on the Ile des Juifs, an island within view of Notre Dame, waiting for flame and judgment. The crowd gathered not for justice, but for a message that no man, no order, no oath could outlast the will of the crown. De Molay had spent years in captivity. His body bore the weight of chains, cold, hunger, and agony. Yet there was no tremble in his step as he approached the pyre. Eyewitnesses noted his composure, not of a man resigned to death, but one resolved to speak one final time. Firewood was piled high around his feet. Ropes lashed him to the post, tight enough to hold, loose enough to allow his lungs one last defiance. When the torch was lowered, the flames did not leap immediately. Smoke rose first, curling upward like an ancient spirit returning home. Then came his voice, through the crackling of timber and the growing heat. Jacques de Molay spoke not to the crowd, nor to the priests who crossed themselves from a safe distance. He spoke to 2 men, Philippe Fort of France and Pope Clement V. His words were not frantic or vengeful. They were precise, deliberate, and cold as iron. He declared the innocence of the Templar order. He renounced the lies carved into official scrolls, and he summoned both king and pope to stand with him before the judgment of God within the year. The flames rose. Charney, bound beside him, echoed the same defiance. There were no pleas for mercy, no cries of pain, only the sound of burning and the weight of prophecy. Onlookers who expected screams witnessed something else entirely. They saw 2 men refuse erasure, even as fire consumed them. They saw not heretics, but martyrs, not criminals, but relics of a vanishing code. By nightfall, the ashes remained. The pyres collapsed into embers. Guards shoveled the remnants into the river. No tombs were built. No rites performed. Philip believed he had silenced the Templars forever. He did not realize he had carved their memory deeper into stone. In the days that followed, whispers filled the streets. Some claimed to see strange shapes in the smoke. Others insisted the executioners wept. But all agreed on one thing: the Grand Master had died, with his eyes open, staring into the sky, as if already seeing what others could not. A month later, Clement V succumbed to illness. His death was slow, marked by seizures, visions, and a terrible fever that baffled physicians. He never returned to Rome. His body was laid to rest far from the Holy See he had once led, overshadowed by rumors he could never shake. Before the year ended, Philip IV followed. During a routine hunting expedition in the forest of Fontainebleau, he suffered a fatal stroke after a fall from his horse, healthy, strong, and only 46. He died suddenly, surrounded not by generals or clergy, but by silence. His sons would inherit his kingdom, but not his power. France would never again see a monarchy as centralized, as ambitious, or as unforgiving. Some said the deaths were coincidence. Others saw the hand of divine vengeance. Chroniclers of the time recorded both interpretations, unable or unwilling to dismiss what had been spoken on that island. In an era when prophecy held more weight than reason, the timeline was damning. A curse spoken in flame, 2 deaths within a year, the eradication of a brotherhood, followed by the undoing of those who ordered it. Yet the deeper tragedy lay not in the fire, nor in the deaths that followed, but in what was lost. The Templars had built more than fortresses and treasuries. They had constructed a vision, one of service without borders, of faith wielded with discipline, of unity beyond flags. With de Molay's death, that vision died too. What remained was myth, fragments, and the lingering echo of a voice refusing to be forgotten. The fires on the Ile de Juif may have reduced the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar to ash, but they failed to erase the legacy he carried. In the immediate aftermath of Jacques de Molay's execution, the order ceased to exist in any official capacity. Its properties were seized, its members dispersed, imprisoned, or absorbed into other religious institutions. In theory, it was over. A 2-century chapter in European history, closed by royal decree and papal silence. But power, once distributed so widely, doesn't simply vanish. It mutates. It hides. It waits. What remained of the Templar infrastructure, their castles, treasuries, and documents was divided among rival powers. Much of it passed to the Knights Hospitaller, their longtime competitors in the Crusader Wars. But the most valuable assets, land, coin, influence, found their way into royal hands. Philip IV and his successors acquired what they desired: dominion over resources that had once stood beyond their reach. Yet for all the wealth seized, something had been lost that could not be measured in gold or acreage. The Templars had functioned as more than bankers and warriors. They had been custodians of networks military, economic, spiritual, that kept the machinery of Christendom turning in ways no single kingdom could replicate. Without them, cracks began to show. Local economies that had depended on Templar oversight suffered. Merchants who once relied on the order's safe passage across seas and borders found their routes less secure. Nobles who had trusted the Templars with their estates now faced opportunists and corrupt bureaucrats. In cities like Toulouse and Milan, legal battles over property ownership dragged on for decades. In ports, once protected by Templar ships, piracy surged. Meanwhile, whispers of survival began to circulate. Unconfirmed sightings of former Templars reached from Scotland to the Iberian Peninsula. Some claimed small cells had gone underground, preserving their rituals and symbols in secrecy. Others believed the order had reconstituted itself under new banners, free from papal oversight and no longer bound by public allegiance. These stories were rarely substantiated, but they endured, and in times of political upheaval or religious reform, They flared again, each generation projecting its own fears and hopes onto a brotherhood that refused to stay buried. The legend of Jacques de Molay fed these flames, his stoic death, his final curse, and the uncanny deaths of both Pope and King created a story too symmetrical to ignore. In salons and monasteries, in back rooms of guild halls, and among exiled nobles, his name became shorthand for injustice cloaked in holiness. Over centuries, that name would echo through revolutionary slogans and secret rites. By the 18th century, as monarchies wavered and Enlightenment thinkers began to question the divine right of kings, the Templars were revived not as villains, but as martyrs. In Masonic lodges across Europe and North America, de Molay's story became symbolic. He was not merely a fallen Grand Master. He was the last man to stand against a world where law bent to power, where loyalty was a liability, and where truth burned with the body. This reinvention had its costs. Myths flourished. Some believed the Templars had discovered ancient secrets in Jerusalem, buried beneath the Temple Mount. Others tied them to hidden bloodlines, holy relics, or global conspiracies. Fiction distorted fact, but it kept the Templar name alive, looping it into novels, films, and political discourse. They became whatever the times needed: protectors of truth, keepers of treasure, victims of tyranny. Yet beneath the layers of symbolism and speculation, one truth remained unchanged. The order had been destroyed not for crimes, but for power. Its annihilation served as a template for every authoritarian purge that would follow. Legal mechanisms twisted to serve political ends, torture masked as righteousness, public spectacles disguising private greed. These tools were not medieval relics. They were blueprints, used again and again, from inquisitions to revolutions, from witch hunts to modern surveillance states. And so, the legacy of Jacques de Molay lingers not in hidden scrolls or lost chalices, but in the warning his death left behind. That justice without independence is a hollow promise. That faith tethered to politics will always fracture. And that no system, however ancient, however revered, is immune to the ambitions of men who mistake the crown for absolution. Centuries later, where the Seine once lapped quietly against an execution pyre, the island is now part of a modern boulevard. Tourists walk unaware over the place where one man stood alone and spoke truth in flame. The stones remember, even if the city has forgotten. And his voice, for those who still listen, speaks louder now than ever. Jacques de Molay died with flames at his feet and conviction in his voice, in a world where power was justified by proximity to God. He became something neither king nor pope anticipated, a man whose silence under torture said more than any forced confession, and whose final words refused to burn with his body. His execution did not close a chapter. It opened a wound. It asked a question that has never been comfortably answered: what happens when truth becomes inconvenient to power? History remembers the victors, but it echoes with the voices of those who stood alone and defied them. De Molay was not a revolutionary, not a martyr by design. He was a soldier of faith, a man of institutional loyalty, who believed in the structures that ultimately betrayed him. That betrayal, far more than the fire, is what immortalized him. Not because he sought glory, but because he refused surrender. The moment he spoke his last words, he became a mirror held up to an entire era, reflecting its hypocrisy, its fear, and its capacity for cruelty masked as righteousness. Centuries later, his story still resists closure. It flickers between fact and myth, between history and prophecy. Was the Templar order a genuine threat, or simply too powerful to coexist with monarchs, jealous of any rival allegiance? Were their secrets real, or were their only crime discretion in a world obsessed with control? No chronicle offers certainty, only fragments. Yet the man at the center remains hauntingly clear, not because of what he did in life, but because of how he died, steadfast, unbroken, consumed by fire, but not by fear. He stands now as a figure cast in contradiction, both victim and symbol, both relic and warning. And his legacy asks us not to seek answers in ashes, but to listen to what still burns beneath them.